Welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 13, Boros for Mirrodin. Every week I discuss a drafting strategy for a different archetype, and today we will be covering my strategy for drafting Boros, or Red-White, in Phyrexia All Will Be One. We're on to week 2 of the set, and the archetypes are starting to be a little better understood, or defined. Boros is the second most drafted archetype, and has the second highest win rate on 17 lands. Unlike Gruul, which has started to feel a little contested, this one has been wide open, at least in my experience. The archetype's theme is 4 Mirrodin, which are equipment artifacts that spawn a 2/2 Rebel token with the equipment attached. The other thing that is nice about this archetype is there are a fair amount of 1 and 2 cost creatures, which helps you develop the board early. I aim to have a minimum of 6 1 or 2 cost creatures, not just cards, because the set is fast, and I have found it to be very difficult to come back if you fall behind early on the board. Although I haven't found this archetype to be very crowded, one thing I have noticed is that the power really lies in the uncommons. So as we get further into the set, I'm not sure how many drafters it can support in one pod. All 6 of my chosen commons are at the tier 2 level. Compare this to the 10 commons, one of which was Mythic tier S in Gruul, and you'll see what I mean by it not being as deep of an archetype. My first tier 2 top common for Boros is Indoctrination Attendant. I've been very impressed with this card in most white archetypes, but it really shines in Boros. Being able to pick up a Mirrodin card means that you get another 2/2 when you recast it, and it's amazing if your opponent has used enchantment removal like Planar Disruption or Mesmerizing Dose to freeze up your equipment. Since they have very expensive equipment costs, I've found that bouncing it back and playing it again and getting the 2/2 value out of it is a great response. I've also found that returning a land that you used to bring this out and then replaying the land can sometimes make it feel like you're getting this out for 3 mana. At tier 2, I'm still taking as many of these as I can grab, and as many as I can fit into my curve. My second tier 2 common is Basilica Shepherd. There's nothing special about this card in Boros. It's been performing great in every white archetype, and with the double pip in white, it really wants 10 sources of white. So it's best in the Boros deck that is mostly white. Being able to get a 5/5 for 5 is usually pretty decent in limited, and those stats being spread over 3 creatures, one of which has flying, just makes this a ton of value. It also is a enter the battlefield effect, and there are a couple of blink effects that synergize with this to overwhelm your opponent with mites. Planar Disruption is my third tier 2 common. 2 cost removal is amazing in limited, and this is no exception. And it's also great in every white archetype. Being able to neutralize your opponent's biggest threat, including planeswalkers, makes this card great, and I'll take as many as I can get. My fourth tier 2 common is Chimney Rabble. This is one you'll recognize from my Gruul guide. Playing a 4/4's worth of value for 4 is great in limited, and the 3/3 has haste. This card is performing slightly better in Rakdos, but it is great in every red archetype. And I'll emphasize the importance of the 1/1 again. There are around 25 creatures that only have 1 HP, not to mention the 1/1 mites. So this 1/1 can trade instead of just being used to chump a big attacker. With Attendant and Chimney Rabble being at 4 cost, it's a little bit of a balancing act, since you only want 7-ish cards that cost more than 4 when your standard deck has 17 lands. Hex Gold Slash is my 5th tier 2 common for Boros. It's also great in every red archetype. Cheap instant speed removal is great in aggro strategies. You can 2-for-1 your opponent's cheap combat tricks, and if they play a big green toxic creature, you can use this for a huge swing in value. You definitely want as many of these as you can grab. My last tier 2 common for Boros is Barb Batterfast, and we see our first 4 Mirrodin card. In Boros, I would take this over Volt Charge. It's really just that good. A 3/1 for 2 is pretty decent, especially if you're able to play cheap removal on your opponent's early blockers. It also isn't just a Boros card, and has been performing very well in every red archetype, except for Gruul, where it's just good filler, since you want to be ramping on turn 1 and 2. It is the best 4 Mirrodin card at the common level, and I will stress again that you want early plays in this set, so take as many of these as you can get. Its low equip cost is also advantageous to cheaply move these around to manipulate your stat blocks to match up best against your opponent's creatures later in the game. Now for the real power of Boros. We have 2 Mythic level uncommons. The first is Annex Sentry. A 1/4 for 3 is a decent stat block for blocking your opponent's early pressure. It has Toxic, which isn't super important for this archetype, but hitting Corrupted can trigger cards like Incisor Glider and such, if you're running them as filler. And most importantly, you get to remove an artifact or creature with mana value 3 or less until Annex Sentry leaves the battlefield. This can be devastating to your opponent's tempo, because if they fall behind, it is near impossible to make it back in this set. And what I mean by Mythic level uncommon is that this is a perfect card to take pack 1, pick 1. It's just that good. And if it isn't just for Boros, it is a Mythic level uncommon in every white archetype. The next Mythic level uncommon for Boros is Bladehold Warwick, and this one is strictly for Boros. A 2/2 double strike for 3 makes it very difficult for your opponent to attack into this. It makes all your other equipment abilities cost 1 less to activate, so you can move Batterfast around for free, even if this isn't equipped to a creature. Its equip cost is a bit on the expensive side at 5, but I've already lost to this being equipped on an unblocked flyer several times. This is another great pack 1, pick 1 option, and definitely a reason to play Boros. Now for my tier 1 uncommons. These are commons that I will take as many of as I can get once I feel like I'm in Boros, or as a signal that Boros is open. Hex Gold Hoverwings has been great, but just in Boros. In other white archetypes, they're good filler. It comes in as a 3/2 flyer, gives all of your equipped creatures +1/+0, and you can move it around for 3, which, like most of the 4 Mirrodin cards, its equip cost is a bit on the expensive side. The nice thing about this, though, is they work great in multiples. I had a deck that trophied that was running 3. Again, you may notice another great 4-cost card. If I remember correctly, I decided to run 7 4-cost cards and nothing 5 CMC or above, because I just had so many great options at 4. My next tier 1 uncommon for Boros is Ossification. This is the best removal that white has, and it has been performing very well in every archetype. There isn't any land destroy in the set, and I always go for clicking the creature I want to exile first instead of enchanting my land. It's a 2-cost removal, just like Planar Disruption, but it exiles the creature, so it gets rid of their passive abilities, blocks triggers that happen when it dies, and it also hits planeswalkers. RebelSalvo was my first tier 1 uncommon for Gruul, and it is tier 1 in Boros 2. It's really great in every red archetype, but in Boros you are more likely to have the equipment to make this cost 1 or 2. It's instant speed, hit for 5, and can target planeswalkers. This is the best removal in red, and you should look to take as many of these as you can get. Bladed Ambassador is my first tier 2 uncommon. It's best in Azorius because blue gives you easy access to proliferate, and then this gets multiple rounds with Indestructible. But it's a great target for your equipment, and the 3 power lets it trade well on defense. It also helps fill out the much needed 2-cost creature slot. My second tier 2 uncommon for Boros is Swooping Lookout. This card also performs slightly better in Azorius because of the artifact synergies, but it's an early blocker, and the vigilance is nice if you can increase its stats with some of your equipment. It should also, I should also mention, especially when you have multiple Hoverwings, you can have a bit of a flying strategy in Boros, and this card fits right into that. My first tier 3 uncommon is Hex Goldhalibird. Fun fact, it actually performs better in Gruul and Izzet. Artifact equipment works pretty well in Izzet because it triggers the non-creature spell clause, and in Gruul, it really benefits by having a big, beefy creature to give it trample. It's still a 2/2 for 2 with first strike on your turn, and synergizes with the for Mirrodin strategy, but the dream of equipping this to a large Death Touch creature is reserved for. But don't get me wrong, it's still great in Boros, and giving a flyer first strike is very hard for your opponent to answer. Furnace Punisher is my second tier 3 uncommon for Boros. It's tier 3 in every red archetype except Gruul, where I put it as good filler, since you tend to ramp past your turn 3. Its second ability of dealing 2 damage only matters if your opponent plays a tap land on turn 1 on the draw, but a 3/3 menace creature is great, especially with combat tricks, of which there are several in Boros. Atrax's Skitter Thing is my third tier 2 uncommon for Boros. It's best in Simic, where you are aiming to win through a mid-range proliferate strategy and can easily proliferate to give it more oil counters. It's great in most decks, and in Boros I think the lifelink tends to be the ability I choose the most, since it tends to be a base. Now for my last tier 3 uncommon, Skiff. I had high hopes for this card, and I'm glad to see at least one archetype where this is performing better than situational filler. You have a fair amount of 3 power stat blocks in this archetype that synergize nicely with Skiff's crew cost of 3. It draws a card when it enters the battlefield, and it has Toxic too. The Toxic isn't very key to Boros, but there are enough Toxic creatures in white, sometimes it is relevant. The biggest benefit is being able to crew to block, so you don't have to risk having to re-equip your equipment because the 4 Mirrodin cards tend to be expensive to re-equip. Now for the rares. The Eternal Wanderer is one of the best performing white rares in the set. It's a planeswalker that can immediately ultimate the turn it is played, excuse me, which seems to be a theme in Phyrexia All Will Be One. It's currently performing best in Selesnya or green-white. Taking advantage of blinking Basilica Shepherd comes to mind, and I think green-white benefits the most from having more 1/1 mites. It's definitely a great pack one pick one for every white archetype, and since this can blink artifacts as well, blinking your 4 Mirrodin artifacts is a nice synergy in Boros. Dragonwing Glider is my next tier 1 rare for Boros. I mentioned it in my Gruul guide, where it also performs quite well because of the ramp, but in Boros, I can't think of a better 4 Mirrodin equipment. A 4/4 flyer with haste for 5 is a great stat block, and being able to make another creature into a big flying threat for 5 is very hard for your opponent to answer. It does have a double pip in red, so if I pick this up early, it's best in a mostly red Boros deck. My first tier 2 rare for Boros is White Sun's Twilight. It's a bit costly since you usually want to play it for 7, and it performs slightly better in Azorius, white-blue, and Selesnya. Azorius because of artifact synergies, where you don't need to trigger the board wipe, and you can afford to play this card for a cheaper cost than 7. And Selesnya because the opponent should already have several poison counters, and then this card will just end up winning you the game. It's still a really great card in every white archetype, and an easy pack one pick one. My first tier 3 rare for Boros is Brask's Forge. It performs slightly better in Izzet and Gruul because of the oil synergies, but this card performs quite well in any red archetype, attacking each turn with an X1 haste trampler that just gets bigger every turn, eventually wins you the game. My second tier 3 rare for Boros is Kimba, Caw Enduring. This is a rare that goes in Boros, otherwise it's just a grizzly bear. It gives all of your equipped creatures +1/+1, and for 5 it can create a 2/2 white cat creature. Seems expensive, but the cat creature gets the equipment attached to it. So with your 4 Mirrodin cards, the equipment cost can be around 5 anyway, and this starts to look a lot better. My last tier 3 rare for Boros is Koth, Fire of Resistance. It performs best in Izzet, where I find myself mostly red, have access to Proliferate for the loyalty counters, and have card draw to more reliably play a mountain each turn after activating the emblem. It's still great and a reason to be mostly red in your Boros deck. Sorry, Basilica Shepherd. My number one tier 1 mythic that makes me go, yep, it's time for Boros is Sword of Forge and Frontier. While it may not be a for Mirrodin equipment, it's an equipment nonetheless and has the most synergy in Boros. It gives +2/+2 and protection from red and green, and whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to exile the top 2 cards of your library, and you get to play an additional land. It has a reasonable equip cost at 2, and gives some much needed card draw since the format is unforgiving to cards like Thrill of Possibility. My tier 2 mythic for Boros is Elesh Norn. This card is a powerhouse in every white deck, as a 4/7 vigilance for 5. As if the stats weren't good enough, she makes every one of your enter the battlefield effects trigger twice, and stops your opponents. You know what is an enter the battlefield effect? Or Mirrodin. Equipment still only attaches to one of the tokens, but that's a free 2/2 token each time you play a for Mirrodin card. It's still a little early to say what archetype she's best in, but the Boros synergy is apparent. My tier 3 mythic is Mondrak, Glory Dominus. The reason Elesh and both Phyrexian Horrors aren't higher is because of their mana cost. There's so much for the 4 cost or more to choose from, it is tough competition. It's also still pretty early on in the set, so data for mythics isn't very robust. Mondrak Glory Dominus is a 4/4 for 2 and double pip white that makes twice as many tokens. So this also creates a 2/2 token each time that you play one of your 4 Mirrodin cards, and it sets up a turn 5 Basilica Shepherd to create 4 Might tokens. Last but not least, we have Solfim Mayhem Dominus. Once again, 4 mana cost, double pip and red. But it is a 5/4 that makes your spells deal double damage. Making this thing indestructible by discarding 2 cards is quite the cost, but it can win you the game. Just hope they don't cast Planar Disruption right after you do it. Thank you for enjoying my simple guide to Boros. I posted a full draft with Boros earlier this week that had 3 Hex Gold Hoverwings if you want to see how I use this guide to grab trophies. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Now that we're into week 2, I feel like people are getting a better handle of the archetypes, and I expect the set to slow down a little. Maybe it's time for some Dimir. If there's an archetype that you want to see next, let me know in the comments below. Once again, thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.